So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our session this afternoon on decarbonising transport. As many of you are aware, our Decarbonising Transport initiative is a global, data-driven, multi-stakeholder initiative that was launched after the COP21 a number of years ago. Our session today will see a presentation, first of all, on our Decarbonising Transport initiative, where we are to date. Then we will have a number of key stakeholders who are working with us on this initiative to give us an insight into their perspectives and their engagements in decarbonisation of transport and their roles. After the panel, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers with the audience. And following that, we will have a word of welcome from our Secretary General, Mr. Young Tae Kim, followed by the Minister of Transport of Chile, Ms. Gloria Hutt, who will also give a short keynote, just towards the end of the session. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Mr. Jari Kaupala. Jari Kaupala is the Head of Quantitative Policy Analysis and Foresight at the International Transport Forum. And Jari will today give us an introduction of where we are today on the initiative, the Decarbonising Transport Initiative. How are we moving forward, and how can we take stock and positively inform the next round of nationally determined contributions? Thank you, Jari.
Thank you, Sharon, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here again this year talking about the Decarbonising Transport Initiative. We have a very short session, so I'll keep my presentation short and sweet so that we can hear from our stakeholders some of the key things related to decarbonisation. But I will start with reinforcing the message of the urgency of reducing CO2 emissions. This is numbers and pictures from our ITF Transport Outlook that was just launched this morning, looking at transport demand up to 2050. If we follow the current ambitions in the policies that we have, we project transport CO2 emissions to grow by 60% by 2050. However, positive news is that with more ambitious policies, with the existing policies, with the technologies we already have available, we can reduce those emissions by 30% compared to 2015 levels. However, this is still far away from well below 2-degree scenario world, which the Climate Paris Agreement, for example, called for. So there's a definitely need for more ambitious policies, but also disruptive innovations in the way we deliver the mobility and the goods around the world. The Decarbonising Transport Initiative, as Sharon mentioned, was launched in 2016. What we aim to do with the initiative is to build a catalogue of effective mitigation measures. We want to provide targeted analytical assistance for our member governments, but also the other partners, to identify what are the climate actions that work and what are the cost-effective actions more generally. And what we want to do is really collect evidence for the best practices and bring the stakeholders together to discuss about those key best practices in order to accelerate the transition to carbon-neutral mobility. As part of this initiative, we also want to bring the transport sector to the forefront of the debate, and we're very happy to have UNFCCC here today again and this year, as we want to bring this transport sector to the COP as well and shape the climate change debate with the policy dialogue, bringing the transport perspective to the table. I just want to very briefly mention the enablers of this initiative. One of them is the ITF modelling framework. We have a suite of quantitative transport models in-house covering all modes of transport, freight and passenger, that we use to assess the impact of different policies around the world in different countries, regions, and even at the level of cities. The more important part is the stakeholders. We and the partners in this initiative, in addition to our member governments, we have over 70 partners, and they have been extremely helpful in all the workshops, in the studies that we've done over the years to identify those policies, solutions that work. And of course, we need funders, and we're very grateful for the ITF Corporate Partnership Board, several of the member governments, the German Ministry through the Climate Fund, World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Climate Works Foundation, International Road Transport Union, FIA Foundation, etc., for funding this initiative, which enables us to continue working on this work. In this project initiative, we have 5 major work streams. We want to track the progress towards decarbonization of transport. We do that on a regular basis, looking at the policies that are put in place in our member governments around the world, actually in the governments around the world, and how far they will get us in reaching the CO2 reductions. We do several focus studies with our partners on specific questions. We also carry out in-depth sectoral studies, looking at road freight, urban passenger transport, maritime transport, aviation, etc. And big part of the initiative is to support our countries and regions with regional and national pathway studies. All that building into this catalogue of effective mitigation measures, which we hope that will be useful when the governments are rethinking their transport policies to reduce CO2 emissions. Just to highlight a couple of recent reports. Some of you have been here many times already in this session, so I don't want to go through many of them. But after the last summit, we looked at the policy priorities for urban passenger transport. We've looked at road freight decarbonization. And something that has come up quite a lot is also this transition, managing the transition, and something we did with the government of Slovenia and together with the OECD Tax Directorate, looking at what are the tax revenue implications of decarbonizing road transport. We are currently working on 3 major decarbonizing regional national pathway studies, one with the support of European Commission, looking at the decarbonizing transport in Europe, decarbonizing transport in Latin American cities. This focus much more on the cities with the support of Inter-American Development Bank, and decarbonizing transport in emerging economies, Argentina, Azerbaijan, India, and Morocco, really going into these countries and hopefully being able to help them in their efforts as well, supported by the Federal Ministry for the Environment of Germany. Now, to close my presentation, very short and fast, we obviously focus a lot also on the policy dialogue. And we just recently organized a Decarbonising Transport information session to our member governments in Paris. We have about 15 countries who joined this information session, and we had excellent feedback on what the needs are and where we need to take this initiative in the future. And 3 points came out very strongly. The first one is exactly on the work we've been doing. We need this quantitative evidence to argue for those changes, to showcase also towards the Ministry of Finance what are the cost-effective measures and why we need to achieve this, why need we go forward. But there's a call for dissemination and capacity building as well, and also more targeted support in implementing these policies, bringing together stakeholders to discuss on what are the key issues if we want to implement this or that policy. And last night we had our advisory group meeting for the Decarbonising Transport, which is represented by 3 countries, 2 of the Corporate Partnership Board members, representative of the Multilateral Development Bank, and Knowledge Partner and Sectoral Organization. And we discussed exactly this moving forward for next steps for the Decarbonising Transport initiative. What we will be doing, we'll be building this catalogue of effective measures, finalizing that during the next year, 2020, as the original project plan has been. But then we want to move to dissemination. We want to start building regional workshops and build capacity building in these regions on how you can actually assess the decarbonizing policies yourselves in the countries as well. And also identifying thematic, topical issues for implementation support that can bring together communities of practice, of experts around specific topics, and share the best practices and experience between the countries and experts around the world. So with that very short introduction, I thank you, and I look forward for the very interesting discussion following this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jari. And as the next part of our session, I'd like to invite our 4 distinguished guests to join me on the stage. We have, first of all, Mr. James Graebert, the Director of Sustainable Development Mechanisms Programme with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. We have Ms. Dientje van Veldhoven, the State Secretary for Infrastructure and Water Management, the Netherlands. Ms. Clara de la Torre, Director, DG Research and Innovation, European Commission. And Mr. Umberto de Pretto, Secretary General, International Transport Union, IRU. So thank you everybody for being with us today. I think we're very happy that you've taken your time to join us, to be part of this discussion. And as we just start off, I'd like to kickstart the discussion, first of all, with James Graybert from the UNFCCC to give us an outline of what the processes are for the UNFCCC and how we are, as a transport sector, engaged in that process.
All right. Hello. Is this on? Yes, thank you for the question. Well, in terms of our process, since adoption of the Paris Agreement, our Secretary now has been involved in a platform where we're trying to interact with the parties and the non-party stakeholders, or to say the civil society, the private sector, and the subnational cities and regions. Through this Marrakesh Partnership, as it's called, we are engaging all the sectors, including the transport sector. And that platform has a number of different tools. I won't go into all the details, but it includes an annual climate action yearbook. It includes a platform where we are recognizing the 20,000 actions that are happening globally, including in the transport space. It includes our regional climate weeks we do in 3, next year 4 regions, where we're bringing together policymakers and other stakeholders across the regions and across the issues. So through this platform, we are doing our best to, let's say, address the sectoral issues, but also the cross-stakeholder issues and the need for integration.
Great. And what are the opportunities from the transport sector to scale up the ambition? How can we work towards scaling up the ambition?
Well, not to go into the specific details, but I think you should look at it as an opportunity in terms of what the governments have agreed to achieve in terms of not only climate change, but sustainable development. And I often like to talk about the infrastructure issue in general, of which transport is part. It's about, it is about human development. It's about health, it's about cleaner air, less congestion, access through mobility to economic activity, and many of those things, which I think that's where the opportunities lie and the co-benefits. Of course, there's very specific solutions the transport sector needs to solve, but I think by addressing the environmental issues, you also can solve both at the same time and bring a number of ancillary benefits that are actually required for sustainable development.
So in order to do that, we need an integrated policy approach.
Absolutely. And this is something I think all of us in this working in this sector know, that it's often difficult to not only talk across, say, ministries or across national governments, but also vertically. And as I was just saying, the subnationals, particularly, it also depends on the jurisdictions. Not all countries are the same, but in some jurisdictions, a greater integration of the subnationals needs to be part of the solution. So it's both horizontal across the government, horizontal across the sectors, and vertical, I would say, across all the actors. It's very important. Because it is a sector that is both on the demand and supply side, cutting across all the areas. So without an integrated approach, it will be very hard to reach that. Specifically, as we know, in the climate change arena, we have a limited amount of, let's say, declared targets in our NDCs, our nationally determined contributions for the transport sector. It's around 10%. We need to renew this. We need to update this. We need to work with the governments to make sure we have very clear targets that are done in an integrated policy framework, though. Excellent.
So that leads me nicely into the mention of the governments and what they are doing. To our next speaker, Ms. Tientje van Veldhoven, the State Secretary for the Netherlands. What are the political pathways, and what's the Netherlands' approach to this, and what are you doing at the moment in terms of nationally determined contributions?
Well, I think what the pathways are, at least it's very clear that we need to start discussing the how we're going to decarbonize instead of if we're going to decarbonize. And we need to do that with concrete targets. And I'd also like to congratulate the ITF on having a very clear and consistent message on this, in the sense that there's only one road to the future, and it's carbon-free. And time is not on our side. If we look at the figure that were just presented, 60% growth predicted means that we have a growing challenge instead of a decreasing challenge. And that means that indeed we need to make sure that we get the data right, that we know what the effective policies are, that we start cooperating within government, between governments, with the different sectors, with the private sector, with the knowledge institutes, and we need to start delivering. And so setting a very concrete target, I think the UNFCCC really clearly said this, and I want to underline this. This is what we're doing in the Netherlands. We have set our target at a 49% reduction in 2030. And before the summer, we hope to put our package of measures before Parliament, outlining concretely how we are going to do this. because the technology is there, and if you start directing your energy towards how do we get also public support for measures that we take, because we do take into account that not everybody has the same ability to contribute, not every company has the same ability to contribute, but much can be done, and if you start directing to seeing how you can get it through, then you can get it through. And I think the cooperation between all of our partners is so crucial, because if I go to Parliament with my measures, it really helps if I can tell that Sweden and Iceland and Poland, etc., are also working on this. And I think that if you are in the board of a large company and you have to convince your headquarters that you want to start investing in electromobility, then it helps if you can say, well, these are the governments that have outlined their strategy, these are their targets, so the market is developing. And so we need a coherent, but also in time, a consistent development across all these partners and across all these players.
And in terms of taking stock of where we are and how we can move forward to the next round of NDCs, have you any words on that and how the Netherlands is approaching that and best practice for other countries as well?
Well, we set a clear goal, and we're working really hard across our government with lots of ministers involved on reaching this goal together, because there's lots of cross-cutting issues, like, for example, the energy which is being used. When you drive an electric car, is your energy green or is it not green? It makes all the difference for the climate. And so in our integral approach, we are tackling also these issues, these cross-cutting issues. Of course, our nationally determined contribution is going to be part of the EU contribution. So what we are trying to do is trying to work with other ambitious countries in Europe together, seeing if we can get a more and even stronger ambition from Europe as part of a global discussion where we will all need to do more to reach our targets. And we need to realize that transport needs to play an important role. And everything we don't do in transport, we will need to do it somewhere else. And in transport, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit with many co-benefits from air pollution, health benefits, innovation, job growth. So there's lots to be gained too. So that's why we should set the ambition high in transport.
So I think we were discussing this morning also the challenges within the transport sector, but also the opportunities that they provide, I think. And as the State Secretary has pointed out, clear coordination within the countries themselves is key. And moving on to our next speaker, who is working with quite a number of countries, Ms. Clara de la Torre, Director of DG Research and Innovation for the European Commission. The European Commission also has a goal towards decarbonisation and a lot of projects ongoing at the moment with different stakeholders. Perhaps you could give us an overview of your European Commission view on this and your take on decarbonisation and the steps that we're undertaking at the moment.
Thank you very much. The first thing I would like to underline, I'm not quite sure this is working, is the first thing I would like to underline is what the Secretary of State has just said, is that we have to work all together. We cannot address the challenges that we have ahead of us alone. So the first alliance should be done not only among member states of the European Union, that should go without saying, but still we have to repeat it, it's always good, but we have to make an alliance also with industry and with the society. And we hear the society with this clamor which is increasing, and we cannot disregard it. So they are our allies to take a number of measures that some of them are being taken, some others will have to be taken because we have no option. We have to ally with industry, that's for sure, but also with investors. We have a lot of leading clean tech companies in Europe. But perhaps we are not deploying all these low-hanging fruits that the Secretary of State was referring to. So we have also to convince the investors that that's the path to go. We have, of course, to go on investing in research and innovation with a clear focus to the transition in ecological terms, in economic terms, and in social terms, because it's the system that needs to be changed, and it's the investments in research and innovation are a must. It's not a luxury, it's a must. It is proven that the economies that do not invest enough in research and innovation do not grow. We also need, and in the European Union, we have tried, and I think we have succeeded in making a regulatory framework which is appropriate and which is flexible at the same time, We have targets for 40% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030, so that we have a carbon neutral economy by 2050. And there is no other way around. Otherwise, we will be suffering not the imagined impacts of the climate change, what we know, because the United Nations has done a lot of work on that, and it is not a question of opinion, it's a question of facts and science which is behind. We are going to suffer very much if we don't do anything. But it's a window of opportunity. We have a lot of very good companies in Europe. We have a lot of good science in Europe, which also needs to be translated in innovation and then needs to be deployed in our economic and social tissue. That we have to remember, that is not enough investing in science. We have to make sure we deploy it. And we have also to do something else, which is change many of our patterns, our mobility patterns, and a lot is being discussed in this conference, and there are very good ideas and very good experiences that we should, each of us, make sure that they are replicated. We have to change our consumption patterns as well, circular economy, the production patterns. So there's a whole bunch of things. If we don't put them all to act at the same time, we will not succeed. But I'm sure we will.
Thank you. And I think you've mentioned something and evoked something that's very important, which is the engagement of all the stakeholders, including the industry. And I think that's something very important for the ITF and our Decarbonising Transport initiative. And I know it's something that has come out of many discussions with the UNFCCC. The importance of bringing all the stakeholders to the table. And I'm delighted that as part of our Decarbonising Transport initiative, we have a number of companies that are working with us to give us their insights on how they believe and what they can contribute towards reaching these goals. With that, I'd like to just speak a little bit about the European Commission and the ITF, how we're working together. Perhaps you could just give us a little bit of an insight into your perspective of working together with another intergovernmental organisation. So,
this is working with ITF is a fantastic opportunity, because we heard Jari telling us all the good things that this decarbonisation project is there. So we are contributing, as others, but we are contributing in particular to develop more the European side of the models, the technology watch, and with the aim of not having a fantastic model, a fantastic technology watch system, but mainly to have policy recommendations for the European Union and other countries within OECD for them to use it. And we are also starting now cooperation in a different aspect, is to set up a platform for international cooperation, precisely, where we will have EU member states, but OECD member states as well. And there we will be exchanging practices and all these things that we know, but also trying to develop better sort of research and innovation roadmap for the future in which are the topics, which are the issues where we still need to invest more in research and innovation. So it's a very good cooperation, and I will never be too happy about it.
thanks, Clara. And I think that prompts me to mention something I think that's very important when we talk about the research that we're doing, and you've seen what Jari was talking about today. All of the work that we've done is available for you to read and download and access on our website. So it's not just something that's available to everybody here on the stage and the ITF, but available to all of you as well. So hopefully you'll use that as a resource. Thank you. So with that, I'll move to our next speaker, Umberto De Pretto, Secretary General of the International Road Transport Union, the IRU. Umberto, what are you doing in the road sector? How are you bringing all the actors together, and what's your view for the future of decarbonisation of transport?
Thank you. I think the key is bringing all the actors together, and too often the road transport industry is seen as the problem, and the way I see it, we're an integral part of the solution, working with governments, bringing governments and industry together so that we can realize we're actually in the same game and we need to have the same solutions, but realistic solutions, measurable solutions, tangible solutions, solutions that actually will have an effect. And you should have an easy audience, because you have to realize, and maybe many in the audience don't understand this, but 20 to 50% of our transport costs as road transport operators are for the fuel that we use in the vehicle. So if we can reduce our fuel consumption, we automatically reduce our CO2 emissions. So we have that effect of being the good guys and reducing our CO2 emissions, but at the same time, saving money in our pocket, which is, I think, for anybody who's in business, you're looking at how do I reduce my costs. with this, it was actually quite easy then to get our membership to agree in 2009 that we should reduce our CO2 emissions by 30% by 2030. And indeed, with the actions already taken, we can see that by ton kilometer, we've already reduced by some 19%. So we still one, we're moving in the right direction, but there are other measures that we can take to even go further. But then this requires working together with governments, the right policies, the right measures at the right time. What I like very much about the ITF initiative is that there's a palette, a menu of options, and there's no one silver bullet. It's not, if you do this, you will have automatically CO2 reductions. It has to be a series of measures and complementary measures, working with governments, with the policies, with the infrastructure, with the vehicle technology, et cetera, et cetera. Just to cite a few, and at the ministerial meeting earlier, many cited how public transport is a very important element. Of course, if we have 90% passenger cars who are causing congestion, causing pollution, we have to say, how do we get these people out of their cars into public transport? And I'm proud to say as well that the buses and coaches are actually the CO2 champions and even the road safety champions in terms of looking at our passenger kilometer CO2 emissions and fatalities. So in both senses, definitely an option to take. If we look at vehicle technology, alternative fuels, we can further reduce by 10%. But again, everything has to be put in place so we can actually realize that. Interestingly enough, with driver training, we can further reduce by 8 to 12% our emissions, just on how we actually drive those vehicles. So a lot needs to be done to change the behavior of how we do that. But I think the most obvious one is what everybody refers to as low-hanging fruits. And here, despite my, I think, positive approach, here I'm extremely frustrated. 9 years ago, we came to the ITF, we came to Leipzig, and we put outside so everybody could see a 25-25 bus, so 25 meter, 25 centimeter bus, and right beside it a 25-25 truck. Because at the time, 9 years ago, the biggest obstacle supposedly to introducing these high-capacity vehicles, so longer and 60 tons, was their size. They say, how can we possibly bring these vehicles into the city center? And so we showed, for comparative reasons, the two beside each other say, so if the bus can go in the city center, why could not the truck? If you were to introduce these high-volume vehicles, you would reduce CO2 emissions by 30%. And yet, there's only a handful of countries that are actually adopting this. It's a no-brainer. And how can we then, as an industry, say, we're prepared to do this, we're prepared to go the extra mile, and do everything that we can within our capacity, but then let us do what is within our capacity. And if you think of it, this is altruistic. This is not for our bottom line. As a transport operator, if I want to make money, I'll want to move things in a very small vehicle, because every time my vehicle moves, I make money. So it is altruistic that if I have greater efficiency, it adds to the transport system, and it reduces our CO2 emissions. So it is for the overall system that we're prepared to do this. And yet, governments are not allowing us to put this in place. So on this no-brainer solution, my plea to governments is allow us to do what we can do and reduce already tomorrow by 30% our emissions.
Thanks, Umberto. Quick question on the role of infrastructure in decarbonising. What would you say on that?
Anything having to do with infrastructure, of course, touches road transport.
That's right.
Roads, we need roads, and we're appreciative of every millimeter that is built. It allows us to do our job better. But in terms of CO2 emissions, you have to think about fluidity. And you don't always have to build new infrastructure. What you need is to make sure that the infrastructure is fluid. Why? If you have a heavy commercial vehicle and it has to stop twice within a kilometer, it will increase its energy consumption threefold. So it's huge. Now, how we do that, how we actually allow that free-flowing traffic, that's better traffic management, making sure we don't have missing links, making sure that we do have proper management of that traffic. It's imperative. If we don't have free-flowing traffic, all the great technology that Eric Jonarts and the ASEA and all the constructors put together, it's useless if it's then stuck in traffic and we're just inching ahead. So all the advancements we can make technologically, unless the traffic is moving, it's all for naught.
Okay. Thank you, Alberto. Perhaps we'll open questions from the audience, because I know that quite a few of you probably have questions, as you did last year. Is there anyone with a question for any one of our panelists? And maybe you can stand up and just introduce who you are, your name and where you're from.
Hi. Hi, Elio Vicente, International Chamber of Shipping. My question for anyone in the panel, UNFCCC, perhaps, where are we with offsetting, carbon offsetting? That's obviously been a little bit controversial as of late, and I was wondering what is the official standing on that right now, given the different controversies that's had surrounded. Thanks.
All right. Well, in terms of offsetting, let's say market-based approaches that are presently in operation under the Kyoto Protocol process, it's still functioning. We've seen a downturn in interest in our clean development mechanisms operation and the projects, but it's still happening. There are projects out there, and actually, just not too long ago, we actually developed a methodology for measuring the emission reductions that come from moving towards bicycles. So this is important, even if it doesn't result in countries looking at the offsets for compliance reasons. We're in the process of developing the MRV, the standards, the operational, to create the tools that are needed, if at all, to incentivize results-based financing in certain countries who could do things but need the assistance and need the standardization and the structure. So while the offsets although officially still possible, may be limited, I do think the process has been quite beneficial. Now, going forward, presently under the Paris Agreement, there is a negotiation under what's called Article 6, where they're looking at the market and the non-market approaches and cooperation. And depending outcome in the near future, we hope there could be further, say, market approaches. However, that's not so much in the context of an offset, because in theory, all jurisdictions have a commitment now, and if you're covering the sectors that you committed to, and those are the ones that you're involving in this cooperative approach, it's not an offset per se going forward under the Paris Agreement, but it's a cooperative approach to moving forward and identifying mitigation opportunities.
Thank you, James. Any more questions? Yes, Eric?
Erik Jonert from the European automotive industry. When we try to address the challenges under decarbonization, there's still the tendency to look at these challenges vertically, not horizontally. While in order to get to real results and progress, we're going to have to look at things across policy areas and also across different ministries when it comes to government, and across different industry sectors and operators. I mean, especially when I look now at the automotive industry with clear CO2 targets being set, but frankly, the focus in the discussion is on tank to wheel, not well to wheel. What the policymakers are just interested in what comes out of the tailpipe. And so question like how electricity is produced, is it green or not, is not yet sufficiently being discussed. Of course, there are discussions on renewable energy, but this is a separate discussion. So how do we ensure that we look at this more from a horizontal point of view? I know efforts are being made in the Commission in that respect, but how can we do more of that, not only in Europe, but also outside Europe?
I cannot agree more with what has just been said. And in the Commission, we're trying to reinforce more and more the links between the different policies, because at the end of the day, it's just one economy and just one society. So as you know, we have the so-called Energy Union, and in that package, we are addressing a number of different things, mobility, but also how the energy is produced. We have launched an initiative on the production of batteries in Europe. When we are talking about our regional policy, we are making sure that there are investments for smart investments in terms not only of clean technologies, but also if we want to develop a decarbonized transport system, regions have to invest in the infrastructure that goes with it. We have targets not only of reduction of CO2, but we have targets of usage of renewable energies and energy efficiency. Industrial policy, which used to be a taboo until quite recently, now this is not a taboo anymore. I mean, we have to do some industrial policy if we want that all these things fit together. research and innovation. We can't just decide that we are reducing CO2 and we are not developing the necessary technologies. So indeed, we do in the Commission an important effort, and you've seen, I'm sure many of you in this room, our new program for research and development. You've seen that we have put the topics in clusters, not only because it looks different and therefore we can say it's different, it's precisely because if we don't look at things together, and in particular we have a cluster dealing at the same time with energy, with climate change and transport, if we don't take a holistic, systemic approach that is repeated and repeated, but we have to make it. And so we always make a call to the member states that also among the different ministries this is the case. We put together quite often around the table colleagues from the member states working at the same time in the research ministry and in the transport ministry. And these conversations are not always easy, but they need to be taken, need to be made, and they are so full agreement, and each of us, we have to make sure that this happens.
It's a good question. So for the Netherlands?
Well, I'd also like to comment on this because we had exactly this discussion when we were discussing the package of measures which I just referred to. In our package, the CO2 emissions of transport, of electromobility are calculated under the electricity package, because the electricity package is governed by the ETS. And so in that sense, all CO2 emissions from electric cars are governed by the European trading system. And so that should work good. And I mean, it's been strengthened recently. And we need to make sure that it keeps working and that that it continues to be, but becomes even perhaps more stronger, a driver for lowering CO2 emissions. But so everybody who tells the tale that the CO2 emissions from electric cars are not accounted for, it's not true, because it is accounted for. It falls under the ETS system through the energy production that is regulated through this system. And if I could make one more provocative statement, I just wanted to underline how important it is to set the goal and start discussing about how. Because I fully appreciate the win-win situation that was just outlined from the road industry. But of course, this has not always been the case, the sense that all partners were so aligned on what we needed to do. And of course, as long as there is a very clear win-win with CO2 reductions equaling cost reductions, then that is quite easy. But the question is, are we moving fast enough when we're just doing that? And I think we all know that the answer is no. We need sometimes to go disruptive, and that means also changes in the markets, and that also means that there will be struggles and that there will be people that are trying to protect the status quo. And to avoid losing a lot of energy in that process, it's crucial to get a goal and start discussing on how are we going to achieve it, because then all interests become aligned. So I just really wanted to stress that if you want to move ahead, make sure you get a target and make sure you only start discussing how, not if, because then with all partners you can get the changes at the speed that is needed.
Umberto.
Thanks. What Eric was saying I think is absolutely right about we have to be horizontal. The vertical approach means that you start demonizing one mode over another, and I don't think inherently one mode is cleaner or more dirty than the other. The answer is it depends. On every circumstance, we have to see precisely how the fuel is being consumed, from where the energy source is, et cetera, et cetera. But we also have to say that if we think that an approach is right, for example, going electric, using batteries, and then again, I'll say it depends for what use. If you want to go a long distance, use it for a 40-ton vehicle that goes 1,500, 2,000 kilometers, you would need an over 10-ton battery in that vehicle. So is that realistic today? No, because we are paid to move goods, not to move batteries. For short distance applications, yes, but again, it depends how is your energy being produced. So are we actually having an effect on CO2? It depends. I buy your argument about those who want to just defend status quo, and I don't think there's any place anymore just to defend the status quo for the sake of defending status quo. If we don't have a solid argument, why? Because what you're proposing is not feasible, then you should overrule us. But we need to be listened to, that at times we're saying it is not possible, because it's really not possible. It's not just, it's one, not cost effective what is being proposed. You won't achieve your targets. And as much as possible, let's use these tools that are being made available to us. The ITF has gone to great lengths to make these tools available to us so we can have a very objective debate on what are the options. And let's choose from those options. And we have worked to say, well, ITF, yes, this is interesting. That one there, it doesn't work. It really does not work. And so sometimes if you might see us putting our feet up against the wall, is because we know that it will not work, or you will not get the result you're looking for, or at a cost that is so high that there are better solutions. So work with us to find the right solution at the right price.
That's absolutely right. It's just being provocative to make sure that we all understand that it sounds easy, but it's not so easy sometimes. And so what is needed is real commitment to want to find a solution together. And of course, there's smart and dumb solutions in every sector, so we need to make sure that we continue to distinguish.
And this is a longer term approach of ongoing collaboration, I think, which I think is being highlighted here. Any further questions? Yes? Gentleman at the back.
Hello, good morning everyone. I'm Esteban Coito from the European Parliament, and well, I'm going to make you a question because it's interesting for us, for the Parliament, this concept of the decarbonization. It was a legislative priority in the last legislative term. We will see with the after the elections, but in order to have this and set of effective measures, I would like you to propose you a question about what about intermodality. Intermodality between different modes of transports, because I have to say I was working in the rail sector many years before the Parliament, and one of the main problems with decarbonization and CO2 emissions is the freight transport, and we have seen since many years and continuously increasing the levels of road freight transport and decreasing the rail freight transport. And this has been a priority for the European Commission with the intermodality, but it's still not, let's say, completely addressed. And I would like to pass, an effective message for the future members of the Parliament, and how do you envisage the effective measures in this kind of intermodality in order to revert this tendency of more road freight transport, because otherwise it's impossible to meet the CO2 reduction objectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone like to comment?
Thank you for the question, and a very, very good question. The first thing we have to understand is when we look at the future volumes in terms of freight and in terms of passengers, we're going to need to use every single transport mode to the optimum. Every train will need to be full, every truck will need to be full, every bus and coach will need to be full to be able to meet the future demands, unless you start looking at how many more vehicles we will need. So we need to get much smarter in how we move things, much smarter. We need to move much more, much better, but with fewer vehicles. I'm going to actually say something in favor of the railways here, so please don't be shocked. If you look at North America, trains have 100 cars double stacked. So automatically, that's 10 times more efficient than in Europe. Why don't we do the same here in Europe? I go back to the modular concept. Let's have higher volume trucks. Everything will need to be higher volume to be able to manage the future. And for intermodality, it is ridiculous today that we cannot do a proper shift from road to rail, rail to road, road to maritime. And what will get us there, what I believe, having been in this industry for a while, is digital. The moment we will get rid of all this paper and move towards digital, and we won't have a transport document, we'll just have a data platform, and that the container will move seamlessly from one mode to the other. It won't matter what the mode is. It's that container will need to get from point A to point B through the best means possible, the most effective means possible, through the lowest CO2 means possible. And this will be happening when we have digital and this intermodal interface. We're moving there, we're getting there. We're putting in place the instruments to have this intermodality. Not all the governments are on board, and some are blocking, and some don't believe in a digital future, and so are dragging their feet. We need to create this framework to allow this effective intermodality, but the future is intermodal, the future is digital, and the future will be low CO2 emissions.
Thank you. What else can I say that in the Commission policy papers, always this has been an objective to move towards more rail, as our colleague was saying. And what a better title of a joint undertaking that we have set up with industry precisely, which is called Shift Rail. And I very much agree with the previous speaker that digitalization is one of the driving forces for many sectors in the economy, but certainly for the transport and for the multimodality. This is absolutely essential. And those economies that are not investing enough in digitalizing their transport system, their manufacturing system, are clearly lagging behind. So hopefully, as you say, let us, by the way, if you allow me, we should not be those European Union citizens in the room, should not forget that these days there are elections in the European Parliament, and let us make sure that we go and vote and that our voices are heard. And personally, I agree with the speaker. Hopefully the new Parliament will address these issues as well.
A very important reminder. Thank you.
Yeah, next to digitalization, I'd like to stress the need for investments in hubs where you can actually make the change, but also cooperation. Because I recently went to look at a locomotive on a freight train emplacement, and that locomotive spoke 7 languages. It needed 7 languages to ride all of these railway systems in Europe. So standardization and cooperation amongst countries within and outside of the European Union is going to be key if we actually want to make sure that we make this combination effective, also including rail. And final comment, of course, indeed, we are amongst us, not just with the European countries, also many countries outside of the European Union. So we need to make sure it's not just European standards, but really those international cooperation standards. This last comment also goes, of course, for the previous comment that I made about electricity. In Europe, it's governed under the ETS, but outside of Europe, you need to make sure that you do have a measure for accounting it, because otherwise, of course, the argument goes.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all of our speakers here this afternoon with us and the audience, and thank you very much for your questions. I'd like to let the speakers move back down to their seats. Yes. Good afternoon. And with that, I'd like to introduce, for next words, our Secretary General, Mr. Young Tae Kim, the Secretary General of the International Transport Forum. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Now it's not good morning, so welcome to Leipzig. And I think it was like yesterday that I met you last year, but today I'm happy to be a part of this important and interesting meeting with you and ministers and all the distinguished guests. And thank you very much for your support, ongoing support for this decarbonizing transport initiative. And thank you to our member countries, especially the Netherlands and Ireland, Korea and France, and also our CPB partners, the European Commission, in RAU and German Federal Ministry for the Environment and Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, and many others, who are enabling us to establish pathway for countries to reduce transport CO2 emissions and to help them meet the climate goals. And the outcomes of our initiative have also contributed to the UNFCCC climate change policy process. So especially today, we are delighted to have Minister Gloria Hood from Chile with us. And Chile holds the presidency of COP25. So in December, we'll be in Santiago to discuss the transport-related issues. So please join me in welcoming Minister Hood to the stage.
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I would like to make a couple of comments as closing remarks after this very interesting discussion. And the first thing is to invite all the countries represented here to participate in COP25 that will be held in Santiago between the 2nd and 12th of December this year. And on the days, the 2nd and 3rd of December, we are planning transport ministers meeting, given the importance of the transport sector for all the economies and also for the challenges that we are facing in terms of improving the environmental condition of our planet. This invitation is very important. The discussion of effective measures that can be adopted by most of the countries will be relevant. I would like also give a couple of challenges. After listening all the discussion that I have heard today and different conversations, it seems to me that we have kind of risk in the scope if we do not consider some differences between countries. The representative of Netherlands spoke about what to do and also take the issue out of the European Union. When you come from a less developed country, you face a double challenge. One is to improve the quality and to adopt all the measures that are recommended. But you also have to fight against poverty, against difficulties of people that cannot reach the basics. And that people is much more exposed to climate change effects than the rest of the population. So less developed countries are trying to reach the goals while have to spend in protecting the population from climate change effects. So if we want the planet to achieve the goals, we have to avoid opening a new gap. And I think it's very important to have that focus. And today in this conversation, it was mentioned the issue of digitalization and management. I think that making the best use of existing infrastructure, for example, or the best coordination between modes, it's relevant because that is the kind of action that all the countries can afford. So I think it's very important to focus also on solutions, or the what, as you said also, not just the what, but how. The how, in this case, using management tools is very important. And it's important as well because sustainability will not depend only on how we reduce CO2 emissions. Sustainability will depend also on our attitudes, on getting used to share the limited resources and use the best our infrastructure, for example, or travel in a more compact in public transport. We will have to get used to share this limited space because we will be more inhabitants in the same planet. So if we do not have the view of our commitment with sharing these resources in a very civilized way, the environment will not be good for the well-being of all the people. So there are many challenges that go well beyond transport that we have to consider. And working together, I think, is the most relevant thing that we have to discuss in COP25. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Minister. And I think it's meaningful that in Santiago, for the first time, Ministry of Transport will deeply collaborate with the Ministry of Environment. So that can be a really meaningful starting point for transport world. So I hope to see you all in Santiago this December. So is this the official end of our discussion? So I will close officially. So see you in a moment at the open plenary at 2 p.m. Thank you very much.